Hello and welcome back to the MCAT grind. We have, let me grab my pen, the biology chapter 5, endocrine system. So endocrine system is one of the more highly yielded biology chapter and sections, so you will definitely see 2 or 3 passages regarding some kind of hormonal action. Now, starting off with the hormone types, we have peptide. Peptide hormones are polar and they're small. But because they're polar, they cannot pass through the membrane, the cellular membranes, because they're selective permeable, and thus will need to be transported by either some kind of select channels to actively transport them, or most likely they will act through a second messenger cascade in which they bind to the outside part of the membrane as a ligand, and they will trigger an intracellular response, such as the G protein coupled receptor response, or a receptor tyrosine kinase response, for instance. Next, we have steroid hormone. Steroid hormone, on the other hand, are bigger and chunkier, but they're non-polar because they're derived from cholesterol. That means they are not to be freely moved about in the bloodstream without any protein carrying them, so they're carried around by proteins. But what happens is they can cross the membrane directly and go act on the intracellular regions. For instance, some steroid hormones, they act directly onto the nuclear center and they pass through the nuclear pore, or they act on the nuclear pore to send signal in the at the nucleus. So their effects are slow, they slow to start, but they last a long time. Amino acid hormones are derived from the amino acids, and what they do is either peptide or steroid characteristics. So for instance, epinephrine, norepinephrine are acting fast like a peptide hormone, and they're short-lived. Think about when you're running, it activates really fast, the epinephrine and norepinephrine. However, hormones like thyroxine and trioxydione are both kind of acting like steroids because they are slower and longer to act, and they last for a longer time period. So those ones, thyroxine, that's T4, it acts on the thyroid gland. We have direct and tropic hormone characteristics on top of it. And direct hormones are hormones that act directly onto an organ that is not an endocrine organ. What are endocrine organs? Well, those involve hypothalamus, anterior pituitary gland, posterior pituitary gland, pancreas, adrenal cortex, thyroid, parathyroid, and adrenal medulla, etc. Now, tropic hormones are the hormones that act from one to another. When you send from one to another endocrine organ, that's a tropic hormone because you're acting on an endocrine organ in hopes that it will generate some kind of cascade. Now, typically, the tropic hormones are the ones that trigger the release of a secondary hormone, and we will see in the hypothalamus action. From the hypothalamus, we have gonadotropic releasing hormone that goes and triggers the activation of the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteal hormone in the anterior pituitary gland. The reason why it goes there from hypothalamus to anterior pituitary gland is so that there's a layer of regulation that once they activate it and go and act onto the gonads, which are the ovaries, then after which the estrogen and the production of it will go ahead and inhibit the gonadotropic releasing hormone in the hypothalamus and provide this negative feedback so that no additional ones are made. Right? Because if you think that if there's no regulation in place, there will be just continuous efflux of these hormones and resulting multiple actions being done on the gonads, right? Multiple eggs being released, for instance. Now, we also have growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus that goes ahead and releases the growth hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. And you can see growth hormone is a direct hormone, so it acts directly on the muscles, the bones, and the tissues to stimulate growth. TRH is thyroid releasing hormone, so it goes ahead and acts on the thyroid stimulating hormone in the anterior pituitary gland, in which it will go ahead and act on the thyroid to produce T3, T4, as well as calcitonin in order to lower the calcium levels in the blood, or it could also stimulate production or early development in children, and the lack of thyroid, as we see later, will be devastating. We also have CRF, which is corticotrophic releasing hormone, releasing factor that will go ahead and act on the adrenocorticotrophic hormone, in which it will go ahead and act on the adrenal cortex as well as acting on adrenal medulla potentially. I think it acts directly only on adrenal cortex because of corticotrophic. We also have PIF, which is prolactin inhibiting factor, and this is the only one which is not releasing but inhibits. So prolactin is already being made, and prolactin inhibiting factor goes ahead and inhibit the production. While it's still in activation, the prolactin is not being produced, but that mechanism will be cut and inhibited once the baby is delivered, basically, or while estrogen are in place, it will go ahead and inhibit the inhibitor, so prolactin will go ahead and be produced. Now we take a look at the anterior pituitary gland. Just below the hypothalamus are the anterior pituitary, as well as the posterior pituitary. They're like two balls. The anterior one is in the front, and we can remember the hormones it has using the acronym FLAT-PEG. FLAT stands for follicle-stimulating hormone, luteal hormone, adrenocorticotrophic hormone, as well as thyroid-stimulating hormone. All four of these are tropic hormones in which they act onto another endocrine organ, right? Thyroid, they can also stimulate the gonad to release estrogen. We also have adrenocorticotrophic trophic hormone that acts on adrenal cortex to release mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, cortical hormone, and the thyroid stimulating hormone go ahead and acts on the thyroid gland to release T3 and T4. The direct ones are just indirect production of a substance or a direct action, a mechanism. Like endorphin in the blood basically stimulates increase in blood flow, increase in blood vessel diameter, and growth hormone stimulates the uptake of certain nutrients and the building blocks directly. The posterior pituitary gland is not as comprehensive in its hormones. However, it has antidiuretic hormone for conserving water, and what it does is it acts on the collecting duct and prevent water from being used up too much and expelled. So it reabsorbs the water needed in the collecting duct, and this is activated in response to high osmolarity in the blood plasma. So if it's too thick, you want to get some water in and keep the water into the body, and you pee out less liquid. Oxytocin helps with contraction of baby, as well as help with bonding behavior. Adrenal cortex has mineralocorticoids, which is the release of the eventual aldosterone from adrenal cortex, and it acts on this pathway, the renin and angiotensinogen pathway. So angiotensinogen, like pepsin, is like the inactive form of the enzyme, and renin will be released from a juxtaglomerular cell from the kidneys and act on this, and it will be cut and cleaved into angiotensin 1, in which will be converted to angiotensin 2 by ACE, the the cutting enzyme from the lungs, and it will then, angiotensin 2, act on the cortex to release aldosterone, in which it will increase reuptake of water. Now we also have glucocorticoid, which is helping with modulating sugar levels. So glucocorticoids goes ahead and act on pancreas, and it has glucagon, insulin, and somatostatin. Glucagon is activated by alpha islet cells. Insulin is activated by the beta islet cells, and the somatostatin, which inhibits these two, is by the delta islet cells. For thyroid, the main action is to reduce the calcium in the blood, while parathyroid want to up the calcium content in the blood. They work in opposing manners, so typically if you have too little calcium in the blood, you will gain more parathyroid hormone action and lower thyroid action. Adrenal medulla, also in the kidneys, is responsible for releasing the epinephrine and the fast movement responses. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Take care.